The morning mist clung to the Colorado mountains like a shroud, but through the haze, the crack of precision rifles echoed across Thunder Ridge Shooting Complex with metronomic regularity. 20 of America's finest marksmen had gathered for the most prestigious shooting competition in the country, each one carrying custom rifles worth more than most people's cars, each one certain they belonged among the elite. But at the far end of the range, hunched over a weathered iron-sighted rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum, sat someone they'd already written off before the first round was even fired. Vanessa Chen-Rodriguez didn't know it yet, but she was about to rewrite everything these champions thought they knew about precision shooting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The pre-dawn darkness at Thunder Ridge Shooting Complex was broken only by the soft glow of equipment cases being opened and the quiet murmur of seasoned competitors running through their morning rituals. Maya Vargas arrived 40 minutes before anyone else, her battered pickup truck kicking up gravel as it rolled past the pristine motor coaches and customized trailers that housed the equipment of America's shooting elite. She parked at the far end of the lot, away from the gleaming vehicles that cost more than her annual salary as a high school history teacher in Pueblo, Colorado. From her truck bed, she pulled a simple canvas rifle case, its olive drab fabric, faded from years of mountain sun and worn smooth at the corners where her calloused hands had gripped it thousands of times. Vanessa moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to being invisible. At 28, she stood barely 5'4" in her worn hiking boots, her black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that revealed the concentration lines already etched around her dark eyes. Her clothing told the story of someone who prioritized function over form: faded jeans with patches at the knees, a flannel shirt that had seen better decades, and a baseball cap from Martinez Gun and Sporting Goods, the small family shop where she'd learned to shoot as a child. The complex itself was a monument to precision shooting, sprawling across 800 acres of pristine Colorado rangeland. Multiple firing lines stretched across perfectly manicured berms, each one engineered for specific disciplines. The main competition range featured 20 shooting positions, each equipped with state-of-the-art wind meters, computerized scoring systems, and covered shooting benches that could accommodate the most sophisticated equipment money could buy. Maya claimed position 20, the furthest from the command tower and spectator areas. She'd learned long ago that drawing attention rarely worked in her favor. Her assigned bench looked identical to the others, but she knew from experience that position 20 caught the worst of the crosswinds that whipped through the mountain passes. The range officials always seemed to assign the lesser competitors to the positions with the most challenging conditions. From her canvas case, she withdrew her rifle with the reverence of someone handling a family heirloom. The Winchester Model 70 had belonged to her grandfather, Miguel Rodriguez, a Korean War veteran who'd taught her that precision came from understanding your equipment, not from owning the most expensive gear. The rifle's walnut stock bore the honest scars of decades of use, small dings from rocky hunting blinds, where marks where thousands of hands had gripped it, and a smooth patch near the bolt where 3 generations of Rodriguez shooters had unconsciously rubbed their thumbs while thinking. What made Maya's rifle truly unusual in this company wasn't its age or its well-worn appearance. It was the complete absence of any optical sight. While every other competitor would be using telescopic scopes that cost more than Maya's monthly rent, she relied solely on the rifle's original iron sights, a simple front post and rear notch that required her to align 3 points perfectly. With nothing but her naked eye and steady hands, she began her pre-competition ritual with methodical precision. First, she cleaned the rifle's barrel with a procedure her grandfather had drilled into her: 3 patches with solvent, followed by 2 dry patches, then a final pass with a lightly oiled cloth. The process took 15 minutes, But Maya had learned that consistency in preparation led to consistency in performance. As she worked, other competitors began arriving in vehicles that announced their success and sponsorship deals. A convoy of matching SUVs bearing the logos of premium ammunition manufacturers discharged their occupants near the registration tent. Each shooter emerged surrounded by support teams, personal coaches, equipment managers, and spotters whose job was to read wind conditions and calculate adjustments for their clients. Maya watched peripherally as they unloaded cases that required 2 people to carry, each one containing rifles so heavily customized they looked more like scientific instruments than firearms. Carbon fiber barrels, adjustable chassis systems, competition triggers calibrated to ounces, and scopes that could resolve a penny at 1,000 yards. Their equipment represented the cutting edge of precision shooting technology. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. While her competitors traveled with entourages, Maya worked alone. While they adjusted computerized systems and consulted ballistic calculators, she relied on knowledge earned through thousands of rounds fired in every weather condition Colorado could produce. Her preparation consisted of what her grandfather had called reading the mountain, studying how the morning light revealed air currents, noting the temperature differential between shadow and sun, feeling how the wind patterns changed as the thermal layers shifted. By the time the sun crested the eastern peaks, bathing the range in golden light, the full field of competitors had assembled. Maya recognized most of them from magazines and online forums dedicated to precision shooting. There was Brandon Mitchell, the 3-time national champion whose custom rifle had been featured on the cover of Precision Shooting Monthly. Lisa Harrison held 2 world records in long-range accuracy and was sponsored by every major optics manufacturer. Derek Castellanos had written the definitive guide to wind reading and commanded 5-figure appearance fees at shooting clinics across the country. They moved through the competitor area with the confident swagger of athletes who'd never questioned their place at the top of their sport. Their conversations were filled with technical discussions about barrel harmonics, scope tracking, and ammunition lot numbers. When they glanced toward Maya's position, their expressions ranged from polite indifference to barely concealed amusement. Registration process revealed the depth of the divide between Maya and her competition. While others provided detailed equipment specifications for the official program, custom action types, barrel manufacturers, scope magnifications, Maya's entry was notably sparse. Under optic system, she'd simply written iron sights. The range officer who processed her paperwork had looked up twice, clearly assuming she'd made an error. "You sure about this equipment list?" he'd asked, tapping his pen against the form. "Everyone else is running glass. High magnification stuff. You might want to reconsider before the shooting starts." Maya had nodded politely and confirmed her entry. The officer had shrugged and filed her paperwork with a barely perceptible shake of his head, another small gesture that reinforced her status as an outsider who didn't quite understand what she'd gotten herself into. As the morning progressed and competitors conducted their final equipment checks, Maya's presence became a source of quiet conversation among the established shooting community. She could hear fragments of discussion from nearby positions, observations about her vintage equipment, speculation about whether she understood the level of competition she was facing, and predictions about how quickly she'd be eliminated. Once the serious shooting began, none of it was said with malice. These were generally good people who respected the sport and its traditions. But their comments carried the unconscious dismissiveness of experts who'd never seriously considered that someone might achieve precision through methods they'd long since abandoned. In their world, technological advancement was synonymous with competitive advantage, and anyone still using iron sights was either making a statement or making a mistake. Maya continued her preparation without acknowledging the scrutiny. She'd learned long ago that responding to doubt only validated it. Instead, She focused on the fundamentals that had served her well in countless competitions across smaller venues throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Her grip on the rifle was natural and consistent, developed through years of practice that had turned conscious technique into muscle memory. Her breathing pattern was steady and controlled, synchronized with her heartbeat in a rhythm that allowed her to fire between the natural pauses in her body's motion. Asterisk, when she finally looked up from her equipment and surveyed the range, Maya saw 20 of the finest precision shooters in America, each one surrounded by technology and support systems designed to eliminate every possible variable that might affect their accuracy. They were undoubtedly skilled, undoubtedly dedicated, and undoubtedly confident in their methods. What they didn't see was a shooter who'd learned precision through necessity rather than choice, who'd developed skills that no amount of technology could replicate, and who'd spent years proving that the fundamentals of marksmanship transcended the equipment used to apply them. The morning shadows were shortening, and soon the competition would begin in earnest. Vanessa Vargas sat quietly at position 20, invisible to the cameras and ignored by the spectators, ready to demonstrate that sometimes the most powerful technology is the human ability to adapt, focus, and perform when it matters most. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The competitor briefing began at 0730 hours sharp in the Thunder Ridge Clubhouse, a luxurious facility that resembled a cross between a hunting lodge and a corporate boardroom. Massive windows overlooked the shooting ranges, while mounted trophy heads and vintage firearms adorned the walls. The assembled shooters filled leather chairs arranged in stadium-style seating, their collective presence radiating the confidence that came with years of victories and endorsement deals. At the podium stood Marcus Wellington, the competition director, whose perfectly pressed khakis and polo shirt bore the subtle logos of 3 major shooting sports sponsors. His silver hair was styled with military precision, and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades determining who belonged in elite shooting circles and who didn't. Ladies and gentlemen, Wellington began, his gaze sweeping across the assembled competitors. Welcome to the 47th Annual Thunder Ridge Precision Challenge. You represent the finest marksmen and markswomen in North America, each one qualified through demonstrated excellence at the highest levels of our sport. Vanessa sat in the back row, having arrived precisely on time rather than early enough to claim a prime seat. She noticed how Wellington's eyes seemed to skip over her section entirely, focusing instead on the front rows where the most recognizable faces nodded approvingly at his introduction. This year's course of fire will test every aspect of precision shooting, Wellington continued, clicking a remote that illuminated a large screen showing target configurations and distance markers. We'll begin with known distance stages at 300, 600, and 800 yards, followed by unknown distance challenges that will require you to demonstrate your ranging skills and environmental awareness. Brandon Mitchell, seated in the front row, leaned over to whisper something to Lisa Harrison. Both of them glanced briefly toward the back of the room before returning their attention to the briefing. The gesture was subtle, barely noticeable, but Vanessa caught it. She'd become expert at reading the small signals that indicated when she was being discussed. Wellington advanced to the next slide, which displayed the competition format in detail. Each stage will be scored individually, with cumulative points determining our overall champion. I want to emphasize that this competition maintains the highest standards of precision shooting. Equipment failures, missed targets, or unsafe gun handling will result in immediate disqualification. He paused for effect, his gaze finally settling on the back section where Vanessa sat. I also want to remind all competitors that this event is broadcast live on the Precision Shooting Network, with highlight reels distributed to over 40 countries. Our sponsors and spectators expect to see shooting at the highest possible level. The implication was clear, though never stated directly. This was a showcase for the sports elite, not a venue for amateur experimentation or nostalgic equipment choices. Dr. Richard Blackwood, the lead range safety officer, stepped forward to discuss equipment regulations. His academic credentials in ballistics were impressive, and his technical presentations at shooting conferences were legendary among serious competitors. All rifles must pass chronograph testing to ensure they're within velocity limits, he announced. Scopes must be properly mounted and zeroed. Any equipment that could compromise safety or fair competition will be rejected. Vanessa felt a familiar tightness in her stomach. While her iron sights couldn't malfunction like optical equipment, she knew that Blackwood's inspections were thorough and unforgiving. She'd heard stories of competitors being eliminated for minor technical violations, and she suspected that her unconventional equipment would receive extra scrutiny. During the equipment inspection phase that followed the briefing, the systematic nature of the exclusion became apparent. Competitors formed a loose line leading to inspection tables where Blackwood and his assistants examined each rifle with scientific precision. The process moved smoothly for the sponsored shooters, whose equipment was familiar and clearly met all specifications. When Vanessa's turn arrived, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. Blackwood examined her Winchester with the expression of an archaeologist studying an interesting artifact. He checked the action multiple times, measured the trigger pull with excessive precision, and spent nearly 10 minutes examining the iron sights with a magnifying glass. These sights appear to be original factory equipment, he observed, making notes on his inspection form. When was this rifle last professionally serviced? I maintain it myself, Vanessa replied evenly. The action was checked by a certified gunsmith 6 months ago. Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly. Do you have documentation for that service? Vanessa produced a handwritten receipt from Martinez Gun and Sporting Goods, the small family shop in Pueblo where old-timer Joe Martinez still did precision work the way his father had taught him. The receipt was perfectly legitimate, but it looked decidedly unprofessional compared to the sleek service records from premium gunsmithing operations that other competitors presented. Martinez Gun and Sporting Goods, Blackwood read aloud, his tone suggesting unfamiliarity with the establishment. I'm not familiar with their certification standards. Joe Martinez has been smithing for 43 years, Vanessa said quietly. He worked on rifles for the Colorado National Guard Marksmanship Unit. Blackwood made additional notes, clearly reluctant to approve equipment that fell outside his experience with high-end competition gear. Finally, after consulting with Wellington, he stamped Vanessa's inspection form with obvious reluctance. Approved, but I'll be monitoring your equipment throughout the competition. Any safety concerns, and you're finished. The message was unmistakable. She was being watched more closely than the others, held to a different standard, and expected to fail. The social dynamics during the lunch break revealed another layer of systematic exclusion. The competitors naturally clustered into groups based on sponsorships, geographic regions, and shared experiences on the professional shooting circuit. Conversations flowed easily among shooters who'd competed together for years, traded equipment recommendations, and followed each other's careers through magazine articles and online forums. Vanessa found herself eating alone at a corner table, close enough to overhear conversations, but clearly not invited to participate. The topics ranged from technical discussions about new ammunition developments to gossip about coaching changes and sponsorship deals. It was the comfortable chatter of an established community, one that had existed long before her arrival and would continue long after her departure. Did you see that iron sight set up at position 20? She heard Derek Castellanos mention to a group gathered around a nearby table. I haven't seen anyone try that since the 1980s. Takes me back to my father's generation. Lisa Harrison, who held 2 world records in long-range precision, shook her head with what appeared to be genuine bewilderment. I can't imagine trying to compete at this level without optical magnification. The target details at 800 yards are barely visible even with a 20-power scope. Maybe it's some kind of publicity stunt, suggested Tom Bradley, a former military sniper whose competition success had launched a lucrative career as a shooting instructor. You know, old school versus new school angle for the cameras. The speculation continued, always just loud enough for Vanessa to hear, never quite cruel enough to constitute open hostility. They weren't trying to hurt her feelings, they simply couldn't understand why someone would choose to compete with such obvious disadvantages. In their world, success required every possible technical advantage, and deliberately handicapping yourself seemed either foolish or attention-seeking. Wellington himself contributed to the atmosphere during an informal discussion with several major sponsors who'd gathered to observe the competition. Vanessa overheard fragments of conversation as she passed their table on her way to dispose of her lunch tray. Diversity of approaches is good for the sport, Wellington was saying diplomatically, but we also need to maintain competitive standards. Spectators tune in to see world-class precision, not historical demonstrations. One of the sponsors, a woman in expensive business attire representing a major optics manufacturer, nodded thoughtfully. Our research shows that viewers are most engaged by close competition between top-tier athletes using cutting-edge equipment. Nostalgic elements can be interesting, but they shouldn't overshadow the technical excellence that defines modern precision shooting. The subtext was clear. Vanessa's presence was tolerated as a curiosity, but she wasn't expected to remain competitive once the serious shooting began. She was a human interest story, not a genuine contender. Even the media coverage reflected these assumptions. Sarah Mitchell, a reporter from Precision Shooting magazine, conducted brief interviews with several competitors during the afternoon break. Her questions for the established champions focused on their equipment choices, training regimens, and expectations for the competition. When she reached Vanessa, the tone shifted noticeably. What inspired you to compete with iron sights in a field dominated by high magnification optics? Mitchell asked, her voice carrying the slightly condescending inflection typically reserved for amateur participants in professional events. I shoot what I know, Vanessa replied simply. This rifle and I understand each other. Mitchell smiled politely and made notes that would undoubtedly frame Vanessa as an interesting footnote rather than a serious competitor. Do you think traditional equipment can still be competitive at the highest levels? The question assumed its own answer. Vanessa recognized the setup, an opportunity to provide a quote that would emphasize her role as a nostalgic participant, rather than a genuine threat to the established order. We'll find out tomorrow, she said, offering nothing more. As the day concluded and competitors began preparing for the next morning's competition, the patterns of exclusion had become thoroughly established. Vanessa wasn't being actively persecuted or deliberately sabotaged. The system was more subtle than that. She was simply being categorized, marginalized, and dismissed through 1,000 small interactions that reinforced her status as an outsider who didn't quite belong among the sport's elite. The established shooters returned to their luxury accommodations, confident in their equipment, supported by their teams, and secure in their understanding of what it took to win at the highest levels. They'd participate in a competition that they'd essentially designed for themselves, using standards that favored their approaches and equipment choices. Vanessa drove her pickup truck back to the modest motel where she'd reserved a room, knowing that tomorrow she'd have to prove herself not just against 20 skilled competitors, but against an entire system that had already decided she didn't belong among them. She'd faced similar challenges before, but never on this scale, never with this much scrutiny, and never with stakes that could redefine how the shooting sports community viewed the relationship between technology and fundamental skill. Tomorrow, the shooting would begin, and all the subtle dismissals and polite condescension would either be validated or proven catastrophically wrong. Dawn broke over thunder. ridge with an ominous stillness that experienced mountain shooters recognized immediately. The morning air hung motionless in the valley, creating mirror-like conditions that should have been ideal for precision shooting. But veteran competitors knew better. This calm was the precursor to something far more challenging, by 0600 hours. The first stage was underway with methodical precision. 20 shooting positions stretched across the main range, each one equipped with electronic scoring systems that displayed hit locations in real time on monitors visible to spectators and cameras. The known distance portion began at 300 yards, a range that should have been routine for shooters of this caliber. Brandon Mitchell fired his first string of 5 shots with mechanical consistency, his custom rifle cycling smoothly as spent brass ejected in identical arcs. His spotting scope revealed a tight cluster centered perfectly in the 10 ring. Each shot placed with the precision had made him a 3-time national champion. The electronic scoring system confirmed what everyone expected: a perfect score of 50 points. Lisa Harrison followed with similar results, her shots forming a group that could be covered by a quarter. Derek Castellanos maintained his reputation for technical perfection, each trigger break timed to coincide with his respiratory pause and heartbeat cycle. One by one, the established champions posted scores that reinforced their status as the elite of precision shooting. When Vanessa's turn arrived at position 20, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Spectators who'd been casually observing the proceedings moved closer to the viewing area, curious to witness what many assumed would be a demonstration of iron sight's limitations against modern optical equipment. Camera operators adjusted their positions to capture what the Precision Shooting Network expected to be an interesting contrast between old and new approaches. Vanessa settled into her shooting position with the same deliberate rhythm she'd used thousands of times before. Her left hand formed a stable platform beneath the rifle's fore end. Her right hand gripped the stock with consistent pressure, and her cheek found its natural weld against the wood. Through her iron sights, the 300-yard target appeared as a black circle barely larger than a pencil eraser. But she'd learned to work within these limitations. Her first shot broke cleanly, the Winchester's recoil pushing straight back through her shoulder without disturbing her sight alignment. She worked the bolt smoothly, ejecting the spent case and chambering a fresh round while maintaining her sight picture. The process continued with rhythmic precision. Aim, breathe, squeeze, cycle, repeat. When the ceasefire was called and scores were posted, Vanessa's result drew murmurs of surprise from the spectator area. Her 5 shots had produced a score of 48 out of 50, with 4 shots in the 10 ring and 1 touching the 9 ring. It was respectable performance, certainly, but more importantly, it was competitive performance that couldn't be dismissed as lucky or accidental. Wellington's voice carried a note of forced enthusiasm as he announced the results over the public address system. Excellent shooting from all our competitors in the opening stage. We're seeing the level of precision that makes Thunder Ridge the premier shooting competition in North America. But privately, conversations among the established shooters carried undertones of confusion and mild concern. Vanessa's score placed her in 7th position overall, well within striking distance of the leaders and far better than anyone had predicted for someone using iron sights at the sport's highest level. She's got to be maxed out at this distance, Tom Bradley muttered to Derek Castellanos as they prepared for the 600-yard stage. Iron sights become a real limitation once you start stretching the range. The 600-yard line presented challenges that went beyond simple distance. Subtle wind patterns that were invisible at 300 yards became significant factors that could push bullets inches off target. The targets themselves appeared smaller, requiring more precise sight alignment and steadier hold. Most importantly, the longer flight time meant that environmental conditions could change between when the shot was fired and when the bullet reached its destination. As the morning progressed, those environmental conditions began shifting in ways that would test every Shooter's adaptability. The mountain stillness gave way to fitful breezes that swirled through the valley without consistent direction. Temperature differentials between shaded and sunlit areas created thermal currents that could deflect bullets unpredictably. Atmospheric. Pressure was dropping steadily, a change that would affect bullet trajectory in ways that required real-time adjustments. The high-tech equipment that gave the elite shooters their advantage suddenly became a source of information overload. Digital wind meters provided precise readings, but the numbers changed constantly as conditions fluctuated. Ballistic calculators could compute theoretical adjustments, but they couldn't account for the microclimates that developed between firing. Point and target. Sophisticated scopes revealed wind patterns in perfect detail, but interpreting that information required judgment that no technology could provide. Brandon Mitchell's second stage began with confidence, but his first shot impacted. 6 inches left of center as a sudden gust caught his bullet mid-flight. He adjusted his aim point and fired again, only to have the wind shift back to calm conditions, sending his second shot 3 inches right. His spotting scope revealed a problem that technology couldn't solve. The wind was changing faster than he could read and react to it. Similar struggles played out across the firing line as shooter after shooter discovered that their sophisticated equipment couldn't compensate for rapidly changing conditions. Computerized systems provided data, but Mother Nature wasn't following any predictable algorithm. The wind would hold steady just long enough for a shooter to make an adjustment, then shift dramatically as the trigger broke. Lisa Harrison, normally unflappable under pressure, found herself second-guessing her wind calls as conditions continued to deteriorate. Her usual systematic approach to environmental reading was failing because the environment refused to remain systematic. She'd fire a shot that impacted high and left, adjust for those conditions, then watch her next shot land low and right as thermals shifted the air currents. When Vanessa approached the 600-yard line, she carried no wind meter, no ballistic calculator, no digital devices to provide environmental data. Instead, she relied on techniques her grandfather had taught her decades earlier, reading the movement of grass between her position and the target, feeling how the wind touched her face and arms, watching how heat shimmer patterns revealed air movement that instruments couldn't measure. Her approach to the changing conditions was fundamentally different from her high-tech competitors. Rather than trying to calculate precise adjustments for specific wind speeds and directions, she worked with ranges of conditions and adjusted her hold accordingly. When she saw grass bending steadily from left to right, she held slightly into the wind. When thermal currents created visible disturbances in the air, she waited for steadier moments to break her shots. The results spoke for themselves. While other shooters struggled with overthinking environmental data, Vanessa adapted intuitively to conditions as they presented themselves. Her 600-yard score was 47 out of 50, maintaining her competitive position while several higher-ranked shooters fell behind due to environmental misjudgments. By the time the 800-yard stage commenced, the weather had deteriorated into what local shooters called mountain chaos, conditions so variable and unpredictable that no amount of technology could provide reliable solutions. Wind speeds ranged from dead calm to 15-mile-per-hour gusts that changed direction without warning. Temperature variations created updrafts and downdrafts that could lift or drop bullets by several inches. Atmospheric pressure continued falling, requiring constant adjustments to elevation settings. The 800-yard targets appeared as tiny black dots even through high magnification scopes. For shooters using iron sights, the targets were barely visible specks that required absolute concentration and steady nerves. The margin for error was microscopic. A slight tremor in hand position or a momentary lapse in sight alignment would send shots completely off target. One by one, the established champions began struggling with conditions that exceeded their experience and training. These were shooters accustomed to controlled environments where technology could provide reliable solutions to environmental challenges. They'd spent years perfecting systematic approaches that worked beautifully when conditions remained relatively stable, but they were discovering that chaos couldn't be systematized. Brandon Mitchell's frustration became visible as his carefully planned shots scattered across the target face. His equipment was providing more data than he could process, and his usual methodical approach was breaking down under pressure from constantly changing variables. Lisa Harrison found herself paralyzed by analysis, unable to commit to wind calls when her instruments showed conditions changing every few seconds. The crisis wasn't just meteorological, it was philosophical. The entire modern approach to precision shooting was built on the assumption that technology could provide solutions to environmental challenges. When those challenges exceeded technology's ability to process and predict, the shooters who'd become dependent on their equipment found themselves without the fundamental skills needed to adapt. Wellington watched from the control tower as scores began dropping across the board. The live television broadcast was capturing struggles that the sport's premier competitors weren't supposed to experience. Sponsors who'd invested heavily in high-tech equipment were seeing their products fail under conditions that demanded human judgment rather than electronic calculation. The competition that was supposed to showcase the pinnacle of precision shooting was turning into a demonstration of technology's limitations. 20 of America's finest marksmen were discovering that their sophisticated equipment couldn't solve problems that required adaptability, intuition, and fundamental marksmanship skills that couldn't be purchased or programmed. At position 20, Vanessa continued shooting with the same steady rhythm she'd maintained throughout the morning. The deteriorating conditions weren't ideal, but they weren't unfamiliar either. She'd learned to shoot in Colorado's mountains, where environmental stability was rare and adaptability was essential. Her iron sights couldn't provide electronic data about wind speed and direction, but they also couldn't overwhelm her with information that changed faster than she could process it. As the morning stages concluded, the leaderboard told a story that no one had anticipated. The technological advantages that were supposed to separate the elite from the amateur were proving insufficient when conditions demanded skills that couldn't be bought, programmed, or downloaded. The brewing crisis had arrived, and it was about to separate the truly skilled from those who'd become dependent on their equipment to solve problems that ultimately required human judgment, adaptability, and fundamental marksmanship that transcended any technology. The afternoon brought news that sent ripples of concern through the competitor area and had Wellington frantically consulting with his range safety team. The National Weather Service had issued a high wind advisory for the Thunder Ridge area, with sustained winds expected to reach 25 miles per hour and gusts potentially exceeding 40. Under normal circumstances, such conditions would result in an immediate postponement of precision shooting activities, but this wasn't a normal circumstance. The Thunder Ridge Precision Challenge was being broadcast live to an international audience, with major sponsors who'd invested six-figure sums in the event's production and promotion. Postponement would mean rescheduling conflicts with other major competitions, potential loss of television coverage, and disappointed sponsors who'd flown in from across the country to witness what was supposed to be a showcase of American shooting excellence. Wellington gathered the competitors in the clubhouse for an emergency briefing, his usual confident demeanor replaced by visible tension. The weather forecast was displayed on the main screen, showing wind speed predictions that would challenge even the most experienced shooters. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying forced optimism, "we're facing some challenging conditions for this afternoon's unknown distance stage." The unknown distance portion was traditionally the most demanding part of the competition. Unlike the morning's known distance stages where shooters could prepare specific sight adjustments, the afternoon would present targets at unmarked ranges that competitors would have to estimate using their equipment and experience. Successful ranging required a combination of optical precision, mathematical calculation, and environmental awareness that separated true masters from merely skilled shooters. Range safety protocols remain in effect, Wellington continued, but we're going to proceed with the competition. The targets have been positioned at distances between 400 and 900 yards, and you'll have 2 minutes per target to range, adjust, and engage. Dr. Blackwood stepped forward to address the technical aspects of shooting in high wind conditions. Equipment security will be critical, he announced grimly. Loose components, inadequately secured scopes, or improperly torqued mounts could create safety hazards. Any shooter who experiences equipment failure will be immediately removed from the competition. The implication was clear but unspoken. These conditions would ruthlessly expose any weakness in equipment or technique. Shooters who'd relied heavily on technological assistance would face their ultimate test, while those with equipment problems would be eliminated without ceremony. As competitors dispersed to prepare their equipment for the challenging afternoon stage, the established hierarchy began showing cracks under pressure. Brandon Mitchell's support team worked frantically to ensure his scope mounts could withstand the predicted wind loads, while Lisa Harrison conducted repeated function checks on her ballistic calculator and electronic wind meter. The sophisticated equipment that had given them advantages in controlled conditions was now becoming a source of anxiety and potential failure points. Derek Castellanos, whose reputation was built on systematic precision, stood beside his shooting position with a handheld weather station, taking readings every few minutes and making notes in a waterproof logbook. His preparation routine, normally a model of confident efficiency, had taken on an edge of desperation as he tried to predict and prepare for conditions that were inherently unpredictable. Tom Bradley assembled his support team around a laptop computer displaying advanced ballistic software that could theoretically calculate trajectory adjustments for varying wind conditions. The group huddled over atmospheric data and wind speed projections, their discussion growing more intense as they realized that the software couldn't account for the microclimates and turbulence patterns that would develop in the mountain terrain. Meanwhile, at position 20, Vanessa's preparation remained notably unchanged from the morning routine. She checked her rifle's function with the same methodical process, cleaned the barrel with identical care, and verified her iron sight alignment without any apparent concern about the deteriorating conditions. Her lack of sophisticated equipment meant she had fewer potential failure points, but it also meant she'd be shooting blind. Compared to competitors with range-finding scopes and ballistic computers, the philosophical divide that had been developing throughout the morning crystallized into a moment of truth that would define the competition's outcome. 20 elite shooters who'd built their careers on technological supremacy were about to face conditions that would test whether their fundamental skills could match their equipment investments. As the wind began building to the predicted levels, the first signs of equipment stress became apparent. Several competitors reported scope tracking issues as their optics struggled to maintain zero under vibration from sustained winds. Electronic devices began displaying error messages or inconsistent readings as atmospheric pressure and temperature fluctuations exceeded their calibrated parameters. The targets for the unknown distance stage were positioned at locations that required competitors to account for elevation changes, wind deflection, and atmospheric conditions that varied significantly across the range. A target at 600 yards might require different adjustments than one at 650 yards, not just because of distance but because of terrain features that channeled wind differently or created unique thermal patterns. When the competition resumed, the contrast between different approaches to marksmanship became starkly apparent. Shooters using sophisticated ranging equipment found themselves overwhelmed by data that changed faster than they could process it. Wind meters provided readings that varied from second to second. Ballistic calculators offered solutions-based on theoretical conditions that didn't match the chaotic reality of mountain weather. And high magnification scopes revealed wind patterns, so complex that interpretation became nearly impossible. Brandon Mitchell's first attempt at the unknown distance stage illustrated the crisis facing technology-dependent shooters. His laser rangefinder indicated a target at 723 yards, but when he consulted his ballistic calculator for the appropriate adjustment, the device showed 3 different solutions based on varying atmospheric inputs. By the time he'd attempted to reconcile the conflicting data, precious seconds had elapsed, and the wind conditions had changed again. His shot, when it finally came, impacted 18 inches low and 12 inches left of the target center. The sophisticated equipment that was supposed to provide precise solutions had instead created analysis paralysis that prevented him from adapting to rapidly changing conditions. Lisa Harrison faced similar challenges as her systematic approach to environmental reading collapsed under the weight of information overload. Her digital wind meter showed gusts varying from 12 to 31 miles per hour, with directions shifting across a 40-degree arc. Her scope's ballistic reticle, designed to provide precise holdover points for specific distances, became useless when the environmental conditions didn't match the programmed parameters. One by one, the established champions discovered that their technological advantages were becoming liabilities when conditions exceeded their equipment's ability to provide reliable solutions. The very systems that had elevated them above their competition were now preventing them from adapting to challenges that required intuitive judgment rather than calculated precision. Derek Castellanos, whose instructional videos had taught thousands of shooters to rely on systematic data analysis, found himself paralyzed by the complexity of information his instruments provided. He'd built his reputation on methodical approaches that worked beautifully in controlled conditions, but the mountain chaos defied any systematic solution. When Vanessa approached her first unknown distance target, she carried no laser rangefinder, no ballistic calculator, no digital wind meter to provide environmental data. Instead, she relied on visual cues that couldn't malfunction or provide conflicting information. She estimated range by comparing the target's apparent size to known reference points, judged wind conditions by observing vegetation movement and feeling air currents on her exposed skin, and made elevation adjustments based on experience gained through thousands of rounds fired in similar terrain. Her process was faster, more intuitive, and less dependent on conditions remaining stable during her analysis. While other shooters struggled to reconcile conflicting data from multiple instruments, Vanessa made decisions based on direct observation and immediate feedback that couldn't be corrupted by atmospheric interference or electronic glitches. First target appeared to be approximately 550 yards distant, positioned on a slight rise that would require compensation for the upward angle. Wind patterns were visible in the grass movement between her position and the target, showing a general left-to-right flow with occasional gusts that disturbed the otherwise steady pattern. Vanessa settled into her shooting position, aligned her iron sights with the target center, adjusted her hold to compensate for the estimated wind drift, and fired without hesitation. The shot broke cleanly, and through her sights, she could see the distinctive puff of dust that indicated a solid hit near the target center. While sophisticated shooters around her struggled with equipment malfunctions and data analysis, Vanessa was demonstrating that fundamental marksmanship skills could transcend any technological advantage. Her iron sights couldn't provide electronic data about atmospheric conditions, but they also couldn't overwhelm her with information that changed faster than she could process it. The moment of truth had arrived, and it was revealing that the most advanced technology in precision shooting was still the human ability to observe, adapt, and execute under pressure. 20 elite marksmen were about to discover whether their equipment had made them better shooters or simply more dependent on systems that could fail. when they were needed most. As the afternoon progressed and conditions continued deteriorating, the competition was transforming from a showcase of technological supremacy into a test of fundamental skills that no amount of money could purchase and no computer could provide. The wind reached crescendo force just as the final stage commenced, turning Thunder Ridge into a maelstrom that tested every assumption about precision shooting at the highest levels. Sustained gusts of 35 miles per hour howled through the valley, creating visible dust devils that danced across the range like miniature tornadoes. The American flags flanking the spectator area snapped so violently that their fabric began fraying at the edges. Wellington's voice crackled through the public address system, barely audible above the wind noise. Ladies and gentlemen, we're proceeding with the final unknown distance stage. Competitors will engage 5 targets at unmarked ranges between 400 and 900 yards. Time limit remains 2 minutes per target. Dr. Blackwood had positioned additional safety officers along the firing line, their primary concern no longer just marksmanship protocol, but preventing equipment from becoming projectiles in the powerful wind. Several competitors had already experienced scope mount failures, with expensive optics torn loose from their rifles by forces that exceeded the manufacturer's design specifications. The spectator area had largely emptied as conditions became uncomfortable for anyone not directly involved in the competition. Camera crews struggled to maintain stable shots as their equipment shook in the wind, and the live television broadcast frequently cut to static as microphones were overwhelmed by the constant roar of air moving through the mountain passes. But the competition continued, driven by forces that had nothing to do with optimal shooting conditions and everything to do with corporate commitments, broadcast schedules, and the unwillingness of the shooting sports establishment to admit that their premier event might be beyond the capabilities of their elite competitors. The first casualty of the extreme conditions was Tom Bradley, whose electronic wind meter was literally blown off its mounting tripod during his approach to the firing line. The device tumbled across the range like electronic tumbleweed, leaving him without the technological assistance that had become integral to his shooting process. Rather than attempt to compete using fundamental skills alone, Bradley made the decision to withdraw, citing equipment failure as grounds for elimination. Lisa Harrison's attempt to continue ended similarly when her ballistic calculator began displaying error messages as atmospheric pressure fluctuations exceeded the device's ability to compensate. Her high magnification scope, stressed beyond its design limits by the constant vibration, began losing zero with each shot fired. After missing 3 consecutive targets by margins that would have been impossible under normal conditions, she too chose withdrawal over the humiliation of continued failure. One by one, the technological elite discovered that their sophisticated equipment couldn't function in conditions that exceeded its programming parameters. Derek Castellanos watched his laser rangefinder provide readings that varied by over 50 yards between measurements taken seconds apart, as wind-blown dust and debris interfered with the device's laser beam. His systematic approach to environmental analysis became impossible when the environment refused to remain stable long enough for analysis. Brandon Mitchell, the 3-time national champion whose reputation was built on mechanical consistency, found himself unable to maintain his precise shooting routine when his rifle's bipod legs began slipping on the concrete shooting bench under wind pressure. His breathing technique, refined through years of practice in controlled conditions, was disrupted by the physical effort required to maintain stable body position against the constant buffeting. The crisis reached its peak when Wellington made an announcement that revealed the depth of the competition's problems. Due to equipment failures and safety concerns, we're modifying the final stage format. Competitors experiencing technical difficulties may request a timeout to address equipment issues. The announcement was unprecedented in the history of Thunder Ridge. Never before had conditions forced modifications to the competition format. And never before had so many elite shooters simultaneously experienced equipment failures that prevented them from completing the course of fire. At position 20, the scene was dramatically different. Vanessa's iron-sighted Winchester, with no electronic components to malfunction and no delicate optical adjustments to lose under stress, continued functioning exactly as it had for decades of hard use. The wind that was destroying sophisticated equipment simply passed over her simple, robust rifle without affecting its essential function. Her shooting position, stabilized by techniques learned through necessity rather than choice, remained steady even as competitors around her struggled with equipment that couldn't maintain zero under extreme conditions. While others fought to keep high magnification scopes aligned, Vanessa's iron sights stayed perfectly indexed to her rifle's bore. Regardless of external forces, the targets for the final stage were positioned at the maximum distances the range could accommodate, requiring shots that would challenge even the most sophisticated equipment under ideal conditions. At 850 yards, targets appeared as tiny black squares that disappeared entirely when wind-blown dust passed between shooter and target. At 900 yards, even high-powered scopes struggled to provide clear target definition through the atmospheric disturbance. Vanessa's approach to these extreme distance targets defied everything the shooting sports establishment believed about the requirements for competitive precision. Without optical magnification, the targets were barely visible specks that required absolute concentration and shooting technique refined to perfection. Without electronic ranging equipment, she relied on visual estimation methods that most modern shooters had never learned. Her first target appeared to be approximately 780 yards distant, positioned behind a terrain feature that created complex wind patterns as air currents flowed around the obstruction. Through her iron sights, she could barely discern the target's outline, but decades of practice had taught her to work within these visual limitations. She settled into her shooting position with the same methodical precision she'd maintained throughout the day, her body naturally finding stability despite the wind that was knocking other shooters off balance. Her rifle came to her shoulder like an extension of herself, the familiar weight and balance providing comfort in conditions that were terrorizing her. Competition. The wind patterns at 780 yards were chaotic, but Vanessa had learned to read chaos through direct observation rather than electronic measurement. She watched grass movement between her position and the target, noted how dust patterns revealed air currents that instruments couldn't detect, and felt wind pressure changes on her exposed skin that provided more reliable information than any meter. Her shot broke during a momentary lull in the wind, the bullet's flight time allowing her to observe its path through environmental conditions that changed twice during its journey to the target. The impact was visible as a small puff of dust just inside the target's scoring rings, a hit that would have been remarkable under ideal conditions and was nearly miraculous given the circumstances. The second target, positioned at what appeared to be maximum range, required Vanessa to push her iron sight system beyond its intended limitations. At 900 yards, the target was essentially invisible through her sights, requiring her to aim at a point in space where experience told her the target should be located. Her preparation for this shot took longer than usual, not because she was calculating complex adjustments, but because she was reading environmental conditions at a level of detail that no instrument could provide. She noted how wind patterns near the target differed from those at her position, observed thermal effects that were creating vertical air currents, and estimated bullet drop based on experience gained through thousands of similar shots. When the shot finally came, it was fired with complete confidence despite the apparent impossibility of accurate aim under such conditions. The bullet's impact, witnessed through binoculars by range officials positioned near the target, landed squarely in the center scoring ring, a shot that drew gasps of disbelief from the few spectators who'd remained to witness the conclusion. As Vanessa completed the final stage with consistent accuracy that defied explanation, The established shooting community was forced to confront a reality that challenged every assumption about modern precision shooting. While their technological elite had been systematically eliminated by equipment failures and environmental conditions, a shooter using 19th-century iron sights was demonstrating mastery that transcended any technological advantage. The defiant action wasn't just Vanessa's decision to compete using unconventional equipment. It was her complete disregard for the limitations that others assumed such equipment imposed. She was shooting with accuracy that the establishment believed required technological assistance, proving that fundamental skills could achieve results that expensive equipment couldn't guarantee. Wellington watched from the control tower as the final scores were calculated, his expression reflecting the cognitive dissonance of witnessing results that didn't match his understanding of competitive shooting requirements. The live television broadcast captured footage that would become legendary in shooting sports. A lone competitor with iron sights outperforming elite marksmen, whose equipment costs exceeded most people's annual income. The wind continued howling across Thunder Ridge, but it no longer mattered. The competition was effectively over, decided not by superior technology or systematic training methods, but by fundamental marksmanship skills that no amount of money could purchase and no equipment could replicate. Vanessa Vargas had done more than win a shooting competition. She'd proven that true precision transcends the tools used to achieve it, and that sometimes the most advanced technology is still the human ability to adapt, observe, and perform when conditions demand excellence rather than expensive solutions. The silence that followed the final shot was more profound than the roaring wind that had dominated the afternoon. As range officials tabulated scores and verified targets, an eerie calm settled over Thunder Ridge that felt like the eye of a hurricane. A momentary stillness before the storm of realization broke over the competitive shooting community. In the scoring trailer, Dr. Blackwood stared at the computer screen displaying final results, his expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and grudging recognition. He ran the calculations 3 times, checking for input errors or system malfunctions that might explain numbers that defied every assumption about competitive marksmanship at the highest levels. The leaderboard told a story that no one had anticipated, and few could immediately accept. First place, Vanessa Vargas minus 487 out of 500 points. Second place, Marcus Chun minus 441 out of 500 points. Third place, Sarah Williams minus 438 out of 500 points. Brandon Mitchell, the 3-time national champion, had finished in 14th place with a score of 362. Lisa Harrison, whose world records had defined excellence in precision shooting, placed 17th with 341 points. Derek Castellanos, whose instructional empire was built on systematic precision, managed only 19th place with a score that would have embarrassed novice competitors. But the numbers only told part of the story. What made Vanessa's victory truly remarkable wasn't just the margin. It was the consistency she'd maintained while conditions systematically eliminated her competition. Her stage-by-stage performance showed steady accuracy that improved as challenges increased, a pattern that reversed everything the shooting sports establishment believed about the relationship between equipment, sophistication, and competitive performance. Wellington emerged from the control tower, his face pale and his usual confident demeanor completely absent. As competition director, he'd built his reputation on predicting outcomes and managing events that showcased the sport's technological evolution. The idea that someone using iron sights could not only compete but dominate against the finest equipment money could buy challenged the fundamental assumptions of modern competitive shooting. The first person to reach Vanessa at position 20 was Marcus Chun, the second-place finisher whose gracious approach revealed the character that separated true sportsmen from mere competitors. Chen's own performance had been exceptional by any normal standard, but he understood that he'd witnessed something that transcended normal competitive parameters. I've been shooting competitively for 23 years, Chen said quietly, extending his hand with genuine respect. I've never seen anything like what you just did. Those shots at maximum range in these conditions, with iron sights. It shouldn't be possible. Vanessa accepted the handshake with the same calm composure she'd maintained throughout the competition. It's the same principles everyone else uses, she replied simply. Just applied differently. But Chen shook his head, his expression reflecting awe rather than disappointment at his own second-place finish. No, it's not the same principles. You were reading conditions that our instruments couldn't measure. You were making adjustments that our computers couldn't calculate. What you just demonstrated is something entirely different from what the rest of us were doing. Word of the results spread through the competitor area like wildfire, creating reactions that ranged from stunned silence to vocal disbelief. Several shooters initially questioned the scoring accuracy, unable to accept that iron sights could achieve precision that exceeded their sophisticated optical equipment. But the electronic scoring system provided irrefutable documentation, and range officials had witnessed every shot through spotting scopes positioned near the targets. Sarah Williams, who'd claimed the final podium position, approached Vanessa with questions that revealed her genuine desire to understand what she'd witnessed. Your hold technique, your breathing pattern, the way you read wind, it's all different from what we're taught in modern competition shooting. Where did you learn to shoot like that? From my grandfather, Vanessa replied, beginning to clean her rifle with the same methodical care she'd shown throughout the day. He learned in Korea, where fancy equipment wasn't available and missing meant more than losing points. The implications of that statement resonated through the gathering crowd of competitors and officials. Modern competitive shooting had evolved in controlled environments where technology could provide solutions to environmental challenges. But Vanessa's approach came from a tradition where accuracy meant survival, where fundamental skills had to work regardless of equipment availability or environmental conditions. Dr. Blackwood arrived at position 20 carrying a tablet displaying detailed performance analytics that the competition's computer systems had generated throughout the day. His academic approach to marksmanship was struggling to process data that didn't fit established models for competitive performance. Miss Vargas, he began formally, I'd like to discuss your shooting technique with you. Our tracking systems recorded some unusual patterns in your approach that I'm having difficulty categorizing within standard competitive frameworks. Vanessa looked up from her rifle cleaning, her expression politely attentive, but showing no particular interest in academic analysis of her performance. For example, Blackwood continued, consulting his tablet, your pre-shot routine varies significantly in duration depending on environmental conditions. Standard training emphasizes consistency in timing, but you seem to adapt your rhythm based on factors that our instruments couldn't identify. I wait for the right moment, Vanessa replied simply. Sometimes that takes longer than others. Blackwood's frustration was evident as he struggled to quantify techniques that defied systematic classification. But how do you determine what constitutes the right moment? What specific indicators are you using that our environmental monitoring equipment isn't detecting? Vanessa paused in her cleaning routine, considering how to explain instinctive processes to someone whose entire approach was built on measurement and calculation. You feel it, she said finally. The wind talks to you if you know how to listen. The mountain tells you when conditions are steady enough for a good shot. The answer clearly frustrated Blackwood, whose scientific background demanded quantifiable explanations for observable phenomena. The idea that competitive marksmanship at the highest levels could involve intuitive elements that couldn't be measured or systematized challenged everything he'd learned about precision shooting. Meanwhile, the live television broadcast was struggling to provide commentary that made sense of what viewers had witnessed. The Precision Shooting Network's expert analysts had built their careers explaining how technological advances improved competitive performance. But they were suddenly faced with results that suggested the opposite. Lead commentator James Morrison, whose 30-year broadcasting career had covered every major shooting competition in North America, found himself at a loss for words that could adequately describe what had occurred. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the television audience, "in 30 years of covering competitive shooting, I've never witnessed a performance that so completely challenges our understanding of what's possible in this sport." His co-commentator, former Olympic shooting medalist Patricia Kelly, was equally stunned. "What we've seen today isn't just an upset victory. It's a fundamental challenge to the direction competitive shooting has taken over the past 2 decades. Vanessa Vargas has demonstrated that technological sophistication may actually be creating limitations rather than advantages for many competitors." The sponsor representatives who'd gathered to witness what was supposed to be a showcase for their products found themselves facing an uncomfortable reality. Their expensive equipment, marketed as essential for competitive success, had been outperformed by a rifle that belonged in a museum. The implications for their marketing strategies and product development philosophies were staggering. Richard Hoffman, representing the largest manufacturer of competitive shooting optics in North America, stood near the spectator area with an expression that mixed professional concern with genuine admiration. "We've spent millions developing technology to eliminate human error from precision shooting," he observed to a colleague. "But what if human adaptability is actually an advantage that we've been trying to engineer away?" As news of the results began spreading beyond Thunder Ridge through social media and online shooting forums, the reaction from the broader shooting community was immediate and intense. Videos of Vanessa's impossible shots at maximum range went viral within hours, shared by shooters who understood the technical difficulty of what they were witnessing. Professional shooting instructors found themselves fielding questions from students who wanted to know if iron sight techniques could improve their own performance. Equipment manufacturers began receiving inquiries about whether their products might actually be hindering rather than helping competitive shooters develop fundamental skills. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from younger shooters who'd grown up believing that competitive success required the latest and most expensive equipment. Vanessa's victory demonstrated that skill, practice, and understanding could achieve results that no amount of technology could guarantee. As the afternoon sun began setting over Thunder Ridge, casting long shadows across the range where history had been made, Vanessa completed her post-competition routine with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown throughout the day. She packed her simple equipment, thanked the range officials for their hospitality, and prepared to return to her normal life as a high school teacher in Pueblo, Colorado. The vindication was complete, documented by electronic scoring systems, and witnessed by cameras that had captured every impossible shot. But more importantly, it was validated by the respective competitors who understood that they'd witnessed something that transcended normal competitive parameters. That Vanessa Vargas had proven that true marksmanship excellence couldn't be purchased, programmed, or systematized. It could only be earned through dedication to fundamental skills that no technology could replicate or replace. Within 48 hours of the Thunder Ridge competition, the shooting sports world was experiencing what industry insiders would later call the Great Reckoning, a systematic reevaluation of competitive priorities that sent shockwaves through every level of the precision shooting community. The first casualty was Marcus Wellington himself. The Thunder Ridge Board of Directors, facing intense scrutiny from sponsors and media outlets questioning the event's management decisions, called an emergency meeting that concluded with Wellington's resignation as competition director. His departure statement, released through the facility's public relations office, cited philosophical differences regarding the future direction of competitive shooting sports. But the real story, according to sources close to the board, was Wellington's complete inability to explain how his carefully curated field of elite competitors had been systematically outshot by someone he'd dismissed as unqualified for serious competition. His post-event interviews had been disasters, filled with references to anomalous conditions and statistical outliers that made him sound like he was making excuses for institutional failure. Dr. Richard Blackwood faced similar professional consequences when his post-competition analysis report became public through leaked internal documents. His 14-page technical assessment concluded that Vanessa's performance was inconsistent with established models of competitive marksmanship and recommended further investigation into possible measurement errors or scoring irregularities. The reaction from the precision shooting community was swift and merciless. Online forums erupted with criticism of Blackwood's apparent inability to accept results that challenged his academic assumptions. Professional shooting instructors publicly questioned whether his theoretical knowledge had become disconnected from practical marksmanship realities. Within a week, 3 major shooting organizations had quietly removed Blackwood from their technical advisory committees. His consulting contracts with equipment manufacturers were terminated as companies distanced themselves from someone whose expertise had been so publicly discredited. But the institutional reckoning extended far beyond individual careers. The Precision Shooting Network found itself facing a credibility crisis as viewers and advertisers questioned whether the sports media coverage had become too focused on equipment rather than fundamental skills. Network executives held emergency meetings with their advertising partners, trying to address sponsor concerns about promoting products that had been so thoroughly outperformed by basic equipment. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Their most heavily advertised products had failed when tested against traditional marksmanship approaches. Sarah Mitchell, the reporter whose pre-competition coverage had dismissed Vanessa as a nostalgic participant, published a lengthy editorial that amounted to a public apology and professional mea culpa. I failed to recognize that my coverage had become more about promoting industry narratives than understanding competitive excellence, she wrote. Vanessa Vargas reminded us that journalism should question assumptions rather than reinforce them. The equipment industry faced the most fundamental challenges as manufacturers grappled with the implications of what had occurred at Thunder Ridge. Richard Hoffman, whose company produced the scopes used by most elite competitors, found himself in daily crisis management meetings as sales teams reported customer inquiries that no one knew how to answer. We've built our entire marketing strategy around the premise that technological advancement equals competitive advantage, Hoffman explained to his senior staff during a leaked conference call. But what happens when someone proves that premise wrong in front of a live television audience? The question was more than philosophical. Pre-orders for the company's latest high-magnification competition scopes had dropped by 37% in the week following Thunder Ridge. Customer service representatives were fielding calls from competitive shooters asking whether expensive optics might actually be hindering their development of fundamental skills. More concerning for the industry was the reaction from shooting instructors and training facilities across the country. Professional coaches who'd built their curricula around equipment-intensive approaches found themselves questioned by students who wanted to learn Vargas-style iron sight techniques. The Colorado School of Precision Marksmanship, located just 2 hours from Thunder Ridge, experienced a surge in enrollment requests specifically for traditional shooting methods. Director Frank Martinez reported that his waiting list had tripled within days of the competition, with inquiries coming from accomplished shooters who wanted to get back to basics. 20 years ago, we taught fundamental marksmanship skills that worked regardless of equipment, Martinez observed. Somewhere along the way, we started teaching equipment operation instead of shooting skills. Vanessa showed us the difference. The philosophical implications reached beyond practical instruction into the sport's governing bodies and competition formats. The National Precision Shooting Association called an emergency board meeting to discuss whether their classification systems and equipment regulations had inadvertently created barriers to fundamental skill development. Board member Patricia Collins, herself a former national champion, raised questions that challenged decades of competitive evolution. Are we selecting for equipment sophistication or shooting ability? She asked during a session that was later described by attendees as brutal self-examination. The discussion revealed uncomfortable truths about how competitive shooting had evolved. Categories that were supposed to ensure fair competition had instead created equipment arms races where technological advancement mattered more than marksmanship fundamentals. Entry barriers that were intended to maintain standards had excluded shooters whose approaches didn't match institutional expectations. Meanwhile, at Martinez Gun and Sporting Goods in Pueblo, Colorado, Joe Martinez found himself at the center of unexpected attention. The small family shop where Vanessa had learned to shoot suddenly became a pilgrimage destination for competitive shooters seeking to understand traditional marksmanship approaches. Martinez, a 73-year-old gunsmith whose knowledge came from decades of practical experience rather than formal instruction, was bemused by the sudden interest in techniques he'd considered basic common sense. My father taught me that good shooting starts with understanding your rifle, not upgrading it, he explained to a reporter from Shooting Sports Weekly. Vanessa learned the same lessons her grandfather learned in Korea. You work with what you have and make it work perfectly. The shop's modest indoor range, which had been nearly empty for months as local shooters gravitated toward more modern facilities, was suddenly booked solid with competitive shooters wanting to practice fundamental techniques without technological assistance. The educational implications extended into academic institutions as well. The University of Colorado's sports science program, which had developed specialized curricula for competitive shooting analysis, found their theoretical models inadequate for explaining what had occurred at Thunder Ridge. Professor James Richardson, whose research had focused on optimizing human equipment interfaces in precision shooting, published a paper acknowledging that his work had missed crucial elements of competitive performance. We've been studying how to help shooters use technology more effectively, he wrote, when we should have been studying how technology affects the development of fundamental skills. The ripple effects reached international levels as shooting organizations in other countries began questioning their own equipment-centric approaches to competitive development. The European Precision Shooting Federation announced a comprehensive review of their classification systems, while the International Shooting Sports Union established a committee to study traditional marksmanship preservation. But perhaps the most significant institutional change occurred at Thunder Ridge itself. The facility's new management, installed after Wellington's departure, announced a revolutionary modification to their primer competition format. Beginning the following year, the Thunder Ridge Precision Challenge would include a mandatory iron sight division alongside traditional equipment categories. The announcement generated immediate controversy within the competitive shooting establishment. Critics argued that adding iron sight competition would diminish the event's prestige and technological sophistication. But supporters, energized by what they'd witnessed, claimed it would restore authentic marksmanship values that had been lost. In the pursuit of equipment advancement, new competition director Maria Santos, a former military marksmanship instructor with extensive experience in fundamental shooting techniques, defended the decision in terms that reflected the sport's changing priorities. Excellence in precision shooting shouldn't depend on equipment budgets, she stated. We're creating opportunities for skill to matter more than spending. The changes extended beyond competition formats into commercial relationships as well. Several major sponsors announced modified partnership strategies that emphasized fundamental skill development rather than pure equipment promotion. The shift reflected growing recognition that the sport's long-term health required broader participation. Not just technological advancement. As the immediate aftermath of Thunder Ridge settled into longer-term consequences, the shooting sports community found itself facing questions that went to the heart of competitive identity. Had technological advancement improved the sport or created artificial barriers to participation? Were they selecting for the best shooters or the best equipped shooters? The reckoning was far from complete, but its direction was clear. Vanessa Vargas hadn't just won a shooting competition. She'd forced an entire sport to confront uncomfortable truths about priorities, assumptions, and the relationship between technology and human excellence. The old order was crumbling, and from its ruins, a new understanding of precision shooting was beginning to emerge. One that valued fundamental skills over expensive equipment and human adaptability over technological sophistication. 6 months after Thunder Ridge, Vanessa Vargas stood before a packed auditorium at the National Shooting Sports Convention in Phoenix, Arizona. The venue that had once exclusively featured equipment manufacturers and technology demonstrations now hosted something unprecedented: a keynote presentation on fundamental marksmanship by a high school history teacher from Pueblo, Colorado. The transformation was visible in every aspect of the event. Where previous conventions had been dominated by displays of cutting-edge optics and computerized training systems, this year's floor featured prominent booths dedicated to traditional shooting techniques, iron sight training programs, and fundamental skill development courses. A year ago, I couldn't get anyone to return my calls about sponsorship opportunities, observed Frank Martinez during his presentation on traditional gunsmithing techniques. Today, I have manufacturers asking me to consult on designs that prioritize simplicity and reliability over technological complexity. The shift represented more than changing fashion in competitive shooting. It reflected a fundamental reconsideration of what constituted excellence in precision marksmanship. The industry that had spent decades promoting technological solutions was discovering that their most sophisticated customers were increasingly interested in approaches that emphasized human skill over equipment capability. Vanessa's presentation, titled Fundamentals Over Features: Rediscovering Authentic Marksmanship, drew standing room-only crowds that included many of the same competitors who dismissed her at Thunder Ridge. Brandon Mitchell sat in the front row, taking notes on techniques that had once seemed primitive but now appeared revolutionary. I spent 15 years believing that better equipment would make me a better shooter, Mitchell admitted during the question and answer session. It took watching Vanessa outshoot all of us with iron sights to realize I'd been working on the wrong variables. His transformation was emblematic of changes occurring throughout the competitive shooting community. Elite shooters who'd built their careers on technological supremacy were quietly enrolling in fundamental marksmanship courses, learning skills that previous generations had considered basic requirements for serious shooting. Lisa Harrison, the former world record holder whose sophisticated equipment had failed so spectacularly at Thunder Ridge, had become one of the most vocal advocates for integrated training approaches that combine technology with traditional techniques. "We don't need to abandon modern equipment," she explained during a panel discussion on competitive evolution. "But we need to ensure that equipment enhances fundamental skills rather than replacing them." Her new training program, developed in partnership with military marksmanship instructors, required students to demonstrate proficiency with iron sights before progressing to optical equipment. The approach was generating results that challenged conventional wisdom about learning progression in precision shooting. The educational implications extended far beyond individual training programs into institutional changes that were reshaping competitive shooting at every level. The redesigned Thunder Ridge Precision Challenge, now under Maria Santos's direction, had become the sport's most prestigious event precisely because it tested authentic marksmanship rather than equipment sophistication. The new format included mandatory iron sight stages that had initially generated controversy, but ultimately proved to be the competition's most compelling television content. Viewers responded enthusiastically to coverage that focused on human skill and adaptability, rather than technical specifications and equipment comparisons. Our ratings have increased 43% since we shifted emphasis from gear reviews to skill demonstrations, reported James Morrison, whose broadcasting career had been revitalized by the sport's changing priorities. Audiences connect with stories about human excellence in ways they never connected with equipment advertisements, disguised as competition coverage. The Precision Shooting Network's programming schedule reflected these changing viewer preferences. Shows that had once featured equipment reviews and product demonstrations were replaced by instructional content focusing on fundamental techniques, mental preparation, and skill development approaches that didn't require expensive equipment. Commercial implications were equally significant as manufacturers adapted their strategies to align with the sport's evolving values. Companies that had built their reputations on cutting-edge technology began developing product lines that emphasized durability, simplicity, and integration with fundamental shooting skills. Richard Hoffman's optics company, which had initially struggled with the implications of Thunder Ridge, emerged as a leader in this new market by developing scopes specifically designed to complement, rather than replace traditional marksmanship skills. We stopped asking how to eliminate human variables and started asking how to enhance human capabilities, Hoffman explained during his company's product launch presentation. The shift in corporate philosophy reflected broader recognition that sustainable growth in competitive shooting required expanding participation rather than escalating equipment costs. The sport's long-term health depended on attracting newcomers who could develop skills through practice and dedication rather than equipment purchases. Academic institutions contributed to this transformation through research that validated what traditional marksmen had always known. Fundamental skills provided the foundation for all advanced shooting techniques, regardless of equipment sophistication. The University of Colorado's revised sports science curriculum now included mandatory courses in traditional marksmanship alongside technological applications. Professor Richardson's latest research focused on identifying how modern training methods could preserve and enhance traditional skills rather than replacing them with equipment-dependent approaches. His work was generating insights that influenced everything from military training programs to youth shooting sports development. International recognition of these changes came when the International Shooting Sports Union announced new competition categories specifically designed to test fundamental marksmanship skills. The decision represented acknowledgement that technological advancement had created unintended barriers to authentic competitive excellence. European shooting federations reported increased participation rates in events that emphasized skill over equipment, with younger shooters particularly drawn to competitions where success depended on practice and ability rather than family income or sponsor support. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of Vanessa's impact came from unexpected sources within the shooting community itself. Military and law enforcement training programs began incorporating techniques that Vanessa had demonstrated at Thunder Ridge, recognizing that battlefield and tactical applications required skills that functioned regardless of equipment availability. Colonel Patricia Wells, Commandant of the Army Marksmanship Unit, publicly acknowledged that competitive shooting's technological focus had created gaps in fundamental training that affected military readiness. We'd become so focused on optimizing equipment performance that we'd neglected the human performance elements that matter most when equipment fails or isn't available, she observed during testimony before a congressional subcommittee on military preparedness. The integration of traditional techniques into modern training programs was generating measurable improvements in both military and civilian contexts. Students who learned fundamental skills before advancing to sophisticated equipment demonstrated better adaptability, more consistent performance under stress, and greater overall competence across diverse shooting scenarios. Youth programs experienced particularly dramatic growth as organizations developed curricula that made competitive shooting accessible to participants regardless of economic background. The emphasis on skill development over equipment acquisition removed barriers that had excluded many potential participants from meaningful involvement in the sport. Maria Santos's youth development program at Thunder Ridge became a model for similar initiatives across the country. "We're teaching kids that excellence comes from dedication and practice, not from having the most expensive gear," Santos explained during a presentation to the National Youth Shooting Foundation. "That's a lesson that applies far beyond competitive shooting." The program's success was measured not just in improved shooting scores, but in increased retention rates and broader demographic participation. Students who might have been intimidated by equipment-intensive approaches found that fundamental skill development provided achievable pathways to competitive excellence. As Vanessa concluded her keynote presentation at the Phoenix Convention, she reflected on changes that extended far beyond competitive shooting into broader questions about excellence, accessibility, and the relationship between technology and human capability. "Thunder Ridge taught us that authentic excellence can't be purchased," she observed to the packed auditorium. "It has to be earned through practice, dedication, and willingness to master fundamentals that don't become obsolete when technology changes." The standing ovation that followed wasn't just recognition of her competitive achievement. It was acknowledgement that she'd helped restore values that the shooting sports community had lost in their pursuit of technological advancement. 6 months later, Vanessa returned to her classroom in Pueblo, Colorado, where she continued teaching history to high school students who were largely unaware that their teacher had revolutionized a major sport. But the lessons she'd taught extended far beyond competitive shooting into timeless principles about excellence, perseverance, and the enduring power of fundamental skills. Her grandfather's rifle remained in her gun safe, ready for the next competition, where someone might need reminding that true precision comes not from the sophistication of the equipment, but from the skill, dedication, and authenticity of the person behind it. The new reality of competitive shooting honored both technological advancement and traditional skills, creating a sport that valued human excellence above commercial interests and fundamental ability above expensive equipment. It was a reality that Vanessa Vargas hadn't set out to create, but one that her quiet competence and unwavering dedication had made inevitable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.